You know, sometimes people walk onto my stage and it's like they're wearing an invisible sign that screams, "I am a walking contradiction." They present one thing, but their eyes, the way they hold their body, the subtle tremors in their voice, they tell a completely different story. It's those moments, those raw, unvarnished glimpses behind the facade that remind me why I do what I do. This isn't just about television. It's about peeling back the layers, getting to the truth, and trying to help someone reclaim their life. I've seen my share of chaos over the years, families torn apart by everything from addiction to betrayal. But every now and then, a case comes along that truly defines the kind of psychological entanglement that stops people dead in their tracks. It was a Tuesday taping. I remember it clearly, when a woman named Elena first stepped out. She was in her late 30s, dressed impeccably, almost defensively, so as if her tailored blazer and precise makeup were a shield against the world. She carried herself with an air of sophisticated resentment, a sort of dignified anger that was palpable even from the other side of the studio. Her mother, Maria, sat next to her, a frail woman whose gaze was a permanent fixture on her daughter, a look of desperate yearning mixed with profound confusion. The central problem, as presented to us, was Elena's complete inability to maintain any meaningful, lasting relationships, be they romantic or platonic. Her life was a revolving door of people who eventually, inevitably, left or were driven away. Every potential connection seemed to detonate, leaving her isolated and bitter, convinced everyone was out to betray her or simply didn't understand her unique perspective. The initial impression from our producers, and frankly from me as I reviewed her pre-interview tapes, was that Elena was a textbook narcissist, highly defensive, incredibly self-absorbed, and incapable of taking responsibility. She had been labeled by her family as the drama queen, the impossible one, the black hole of emotion. You heard these labels repeated like a mantra, not just from her exasperated mother and siblings, but from Elena herself, almost as if she had internalized them, worn them as badges of honor and grievance. She spoke of her past relationships with a bitter cynicism, always framing herself as the victim, the one who was wronged, misunderstood, or unfairly judged. Yet there was something in her eyes, a flicker of vulnerability, a deep-seated pain that contradicted the sharp, almost arrogant edge of her words. It wasn't the kind of vulnerability you see in someone who's merely sad. It was the kind that suggests a profound ancient wound carefully hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed defenses. I knew then that what we were seeing on the surface was just the tip of a very complex iceberg. My job isn't just to diagnose, it's to understand the roots, to get beneath the surface of the problem behaviors and understand why they exist. With Elena, the immediate question wasn't just what she was doing, but why she felt compelled to sabotage every chance at connection. As we delved into her backstory, the narrative began to unfold, revealing a childhood that, on the surface, seemed relatively normal, even privileged. She was the eldest of 3 children, growing up in a comfortable suburban home. Her father was a successful businessman, her mother a homemaker, but normal is often just a facade. The roots of Elena's issues, as I began to piece them together, lay deep in the emotional landscape of her early years. From Maria's tearful recollections, it became clear that Elena's father, while financially supportive, was emotionally distant, often critical, and had an explosive temper that, while not physically abusive, created an atmosphere of pervasive anxiety. Maria herself, overwhelmed and often feeling unheard, retreated, leaving Elena, the sensitive firstborn, to navigate this emotionally fraught environment largely on her own. Elena remembered her father as a figure of authority and fear. She spoke of never feeling good enough, constantly striving for his elusive approval, which rarely came without a caveat or a criticism. She recalled elaborate projects she would undertake only for him to point out the flaws, dismiss her efforts, or simply ignore them altogether. This created a deep-seated belief within her that her worth was conditional, based entirely on external validation, and that she was inherently flawed. Her mother, Maria, tried to mediate, to soothe, but her own fear of confrontation meant she often inadvertently reinforced Elena's feeling of being unprotected and unheard. Maria admitted she often told Elena to just be quiet or don't make your father angry, effectively silencing her daughter's nascent voice and suppressing her emotional expression. This wasn't malicious intent, of course. It was a mother trying to survive in her own challenging marriage. But the impact on a child, especially a child like Elena, who clearly possessed a deep capacity for feeling, was profound. The pattern started early. Elena became a high achiever, excelling in school, in sports, in every area she could control. But this was less about passion and more about proving her worth, about creating an impenetrable armor of accomplishment. The emotional cost was immense. She learned to hide her true feelings, to present a perfect, unassailable front. Any perceived failure or criticism was met with intense emotional dysregulation, either a furious outburst or a complete withdrawal. She struggled to trust, assuming that anyone who got close would eventually find her wanting, just like her father, or abandon her, just like she felt her mother did when she didn't protect her. She developed an almost hypervigilance to perceive slights, interpreting neutral comments as attacks and small disagreements as catastrophic betrayals. This created a self-fulfilling prophecy in her relationships. She would push people away, test their loyalty to the breaking point, and then, when they inevitably reached their limit and distanced themselves, she would point to it as proof that her initial distrust was justified. It was a vicious cycle, ingrained deeply into her behavioral patterns, an operating system running on a corrupted core belief. I am unlovable, and everyone will eventually leave. This deeply ingrained belief system, forged in the crucible of her childhood home, manifested itself tragically in Elena's adult life. As she grew older, the patterns of distrust, the relentless pursuit of perfection, and the inability to accept genuine affection without suspicion became more pronounced, more destructive. Her romantic relationships were particularly turbulent. She'd jump in quickly, almost desperately, showering partners with attention and affection, but the moment things felt too real, too vulnerable, or the slightest imperfection emerged, she'd retreat into a shell of criticism and suspicion. She'd accuse partners of betrayal over imagined slights, project her own insecurities onto them, and then, when they inevitably grew weary of walking on eggshells, she'd erupt, blaming them entirely for the relationship's demise. She would describe these breakups with a chilling detachment, as if narrating a story where she was the perpetually wronged protagonist. He just couldn't handle my strength, she'd say. Or she was jealous of my success. It was always external, never internal. Her relationship with her mother, Maria, was perhaps the most painful and complex manifestation of this dynamic. Maria, out of a profound motherly love and a desperate desire for connection with her eldest daughter, tried repeatedly to break through Elena's defenses, but every attempt was met with a wall of resentment. Elena would interpret Maria's concern as prying, her advice as criticism, and her offers of help as attempts to control. Maria would recall trying to call Elena only to have her calls ignored for days, sometimes weeks. When they did speak, It often devolved into an argument, with Elena accusing Maria of siding with her father, of never protecting her, of failing her as a mother. Maria, a woman who had spent a lifetime trying to keep the peace, found herself in a constant state of emotional siege. She felt she couldn't say anything right. If she agreed with Elena, she was enabling. If she disagreed, she was betraying. The tension between them was a living entity, consuming their interactions, making any genuine intimacy impossible. I observed this dynamic firsthand during their initial segment. Elena would cut Maria off mid-sentence, roll her eyes dramatically, and sigh with an air of long-suffering exasperation. Maria, in turn, would wring her hands, her voice barely a whisper, constantly trying to appease Elena, to explain, to apologize, even for things that clearly weren't her fault. It was a classic dance of the victim and the perceived oppressor, except in this case, the roles were far more nuanced and tragically intertwined. Elena felt like a victim, genuinely believing her mother had failed her, but her outward behavior was deeply wounding, making Maria the actual victim of her daughter's emotional aggression. This constant blame shifting and refusal to take any personal responsibility was the core of the problem, and it had reached a breaking point. The family reached out to the show after Elena's most recent relationship imploded, taking with it a significant business venture she had started with her ex-partner. The financial losses were substantial, but the emotional collateral damage was even greater. Elena, rather than introspecting, had retreated into an even deeper well of bitterness, isolating herself almost completely. Her siblings had tried to intervene, only to be met with furious accusations and declarations of disinheritance from Elena's life. Maria, witnessing her daughter spiraling, utterly alone and consumed by anger, felt she had exhausted every other avenue. She tearfully explained to our producers that she feared Elena would end up entirely alone, bitter, and without any meaningful human connection. Maria herself was nearing her breaking point, feeling that her own health was deteriorating under the constant stress of her daughter's volatile emotions. She was desperate, truly desperate, to find a way to help Elena, not just for Elena's sake, but for the sake of what little family cohesion remained. When I started talking with Elena, I could feel that carefully constructed wall. She was articulate, even eloquent, in describing her myriad misfortunes and the failings of everyone around her. She had a narrative prepared, a well-rehearsed story of how life had unfairly targeted her, how she was perpetually misunderstood and betrayed. She presented herself as a strong, independent woman who simply wouldn't tolerate disrespect, but underneath the bravado, I could sense the raw, exposed nerve. It wasn't strength, it was an incredibly fragile ego protecting itself with layers of aggression and self-justification. She saw every question, every challenge to her narrative as an attack. Her eyes would narrow, her jaw would clench, and her voice would take on a defensive, almost combative edge. She wasn't ready to hear anything that contradicted her carefully curated reality. She had spent a lifetime perfecting this defense mechanism, and it was going to take more than a few pointed questions to chip away at it. The problem wasn't just her behavior, it was her absolute conviction that her behavior was always justified, always a reaction to someone else's wrongdoing. This rigid mindset was the greatest barrier to any real breakthrough. She was trapped in a cycle of her own making, unable to see the prison bars because she believed everyone else held the keys. This was the setup for what I knew would be a difficult but necessary confrontation. We had to get her to see herself not as a victim, but as an active participant in her own life, shaping her own outcomes, even if unconsciously. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, deliberate dismantling of Elena's carefully constructed narrative. I knew that directly challenging her would only reinforce her defensiveness, So my approach had to be more strategic, more psychological. I started not by attacking her, but by acknowledging her pain, her feelings of betrayal and misunderstanding. Elena, I began, my voice calm but firm. I hear you. I hear how much you've been hurt, how much you feel let down by people in your life, especially your mother. It sounds like you've carried a lot of heavy emotional baggage for a very long time. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. Her guard's still up, but perhaps a tiny crack had appeared. But here's the thing. I continued leaning forward slightly. At some point, you have to ask yourself, are you going to keep dragging that baggage around, or are you going to put it down? Because right now, it's not just hurting you, it's hurting the very people who genuinely want to be close to you. That's when I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a subtle shift. It wasn't full acceptance, not yet, but a moment of genuine consideration. I continued to press, but gently, connecting her current behaviors to the foundational issues we had uncovered in her backstory. You told me your father was critical, that you never felt good enough. You felt you had to be perfect to earn his love, and even then, it was rarely enough. Do you see how you're still chasing that elusive perfect in every relationship? And how you punish people when they inevitably fall short of that impossible standard? She started to squirm, looking away, then back at me. But they do disappoint me, she insisted, her voice regaining some of its familiar edge. They do betray me. Or, I countered, keeping my voice even, do you set them up to fail? Do you push them away before they can get too close and potentially hurt you, fulfilling that old prophecy you learned as a child? You're playing out a script, Elena, a script written a long time ago, and you're casting everyone in your life into the roles of the people who hurt you in the past. This struck a nerve. She finally looked directly at Maria, who was quietly weeping beside her. Mom, Elena started, then stopped, her voice catching. It was a raw, uncharacteristic moment of vulnerability. This was the opportunity. Maria, I turned to her. How does it feel when Elena accuses you of not protecting her, of not being there for her? Maria, through her tears, finally found her voice. It breaks my heart, Dr. Phil. I did my best. I loved her. I still love her so much. I just wanted peace. I didn't know what else to do. Her genuine pain was evident, and it was clear to everyone in the room, including Elena, that this wasn't an act. Elena, I addressed her again. Your mother, in her own way, was trying to navigate a difficult situation. She may not have protected you in the way you needed then, but she is here now, trying to protect you from yourself. She's trying to protect your future, your happiness, and you're pushing her away just like you push everyone else away because that old fear of rejection is louder than the present reality of her love. I let that sink in. The resistance in her posture began to soften. Her shoulders, previously rigid, slumped slightly. Her eyes, which had been darting around, finally settled, fixed on her mother's tear-streaked face. You're afraid, Elena, I stated simply, aren't you? Afraid to let anyone in? Afraid to be truly seen? Because if they see the real you, the flawed you, the vulnerable you, they'll leave. And that fear, that deep, primal fear, is making you do exactly what you're afraid of. This was the breakthrough moment. She didn't argue. She didn't contradict. She simply sat there, tears welling in her own eyes, blurring her carefully applied makeup. It was the first authentic emotional response I had seen from her, a break in the impenetrable armor she had worn for decades. The silence in the studio was profound, almost reverent. It was the sound of a carefully constructed fortress beginning to crumble. It's not about what happened in the past anymore, Elena, I said softly, my voice cutting through the silence. It's about what you do with it. right here, right now. Are you going to keep letting that past dictate your future? Or are you going to choose a different path? Are you going to learn to trust, to truly connect, to finally break free from this self-imposed isolation? I laid out a clear choice, not a judgment, but a stark reality. She looked from me to her mother and then down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. The battle was still raging within her, but for the first time, it felt like she was genuinely considering surrender, considering laying down her weapons. The internal conflict was palpable, a war between the wounded child and the defensive adult. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of years of pain and unresolved conflict. Elena finally looked up, her eyes red, but with a clarity I hadn't seen before. "Ed, I don't know how," she whispered, her voice raw and fragile. "I don't know how to stop." This wasn't the defiant Elena, the one who always had an answer, a justification. This was the scared little girl who never felt good enough, finally peeking out from behind the fortress walls. "That's okay," I responded, my voice gentle. "Knowing you don't know how is the first step. It means you're open to learning. You see, Elena, the real truth isn't that people are out to betray you. The real truth is that you're so terrified of being hurt again, you've decided to hurt them first, to push them away before they get a chance. You've become an expert at self-sabotage, an architect of your own loneliness, and you've done it because a part of you believes you don't deserve anything better, that this pain is all you're destined for." I paused, allowing the gravity of that statement to sink in. "But that's a lie, Elena, a lie you learned a long time ago, and now it's time to unlearn it. It's time to challenge that narrative, to rewrite the script. You are worthy of love, of connection, of genuine happiness. But you're going to have to make a choice. Are you going to keep blaming everyone else, or are you going to take responsibility for your own healing, for your own future?" She took a deep, shaky breath, and then, to everyone's surprise, she reached out and took Maria's trembling hand. Maria gasped softly, tears streaming down her face. It was a gesture that spoke volumes, a bridge forming across decades of emotional distance. "Mom," Elena began, her voice still hoarse, I'm sorry. I really am. I didn't want to hurt you." Maria, overcome, simply squeezed her daughter's hand, unable to speak, her face a mixture of relief and profound sadness. This was a critical pivot point, but it wasn't the end of the journey. A single apology, a moment of vulnerability, doesn't erase years of ingrained patterns. That's a powerful first step, Elena, I acknowledged. But an apology is just words if it's not followed by action. The real work begins now. The work of looking inward, of identifying those triggers, those automatic defensive reactions, and consciously choosing a different path. I explained to her that she needed to understand that her perception of rejection was often not about others' intent, but about her own interpretation filtered through the lens of past trauma. We talked about how she would catastrophize small disagreements into relationship-ending betrayals, how she would test people's loyalty until they inevitably broke. You've been asking people to prove their love for you, Elena. I elaborated, but you've set the bar impossibly high. And every time they fail to clear it, you confirm your own deepest fears. You're trying to control the outcome, trying to prevent pain, but you're actually creating it. We then discussed concrete strategies. I emphasized the importance of therapy, not just to process her past, but to develop practical coping mechanisms for managing her emotional triggers and challenging her cognitive distortions. She needed to learn to identify when her inner critic was speaking, when that old, wounded child was driving her behavior and how to consciously choose a more mature, healthy response. This meant practicing mindful self-awareness, learning to pause before reacting, and developing healthier communication skills. Instead of lashing out or withdrawing, she needed to learn to articulate her feelings, her fears, and her needs in a constructive way. "You're not going to fix this overnight," I told her directly. "This is going to be hard work, the hardest work you've ever done. It's going to require courage, honesty, and a willingness to feel uncomfortable. You're going to stumble, you're going to revert to old patterns sometimes. But the difference now will be that you'll have the tools to recognize it, to acknowledge it, and to get back on track. This isn't about being perfect, Elena. It's about being consistently committed to your own growth and well-being." Maria, still holding Elena's hand, nodded in agreement, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. It was a long road ahead, but for the first time in a very long time, it felt like Elena was actually willing to walk it. The weeks and months that followed were, as expected, a roller coaster for Elena. Our production team kept in touch, and Maria would provide updates. There were good days, days where Elena seemed genuinely lighter, more open, even reaching out to some of her estranged friends and family. She started therapy, a commitment she hadn't managed to sustain in the past, and she seemed to be genuinely engaged in the process. She was learning to identify her triggers, to recognize when she was falling back into old patterns of self-sabotage, and to consciously choose different responses. She was beginning to understand that her constant need for control and her intense fear of abandonment were two sides of the same coin, born from that core wound of feeling unloved and unprotected as a child. However, there were also significant setbacks. There were times when the old anger would flare up, when she would retreat into her familiar shell of defensiveness and blame. Maria would call our team disheartened, saying, "She's doing it again, Dr. Phil." She pushed away her new therapist because she felt judged. She had another fight with her sister over something trivial. It was clear that breaking a lifetime of deeply ingrained psychological patterns wasn't just a matter of a single breakthrough moment on television. It was a grueling, day-by-day battle against years of conditioning. The initial euphoria of the onstage breakthrough often gives way to the grinding reality of everyday emotional labor. One particular incident stood out during this period. Elena had begun to tentatively date someone new, a kind and patient man who seemed genuinely interested in her. For a while, things were going well. Then, he was delayed by an unexpected work emergency and had to cancel a dinner date at the last minute. Elena, rather than expressing disappointment or understanding, immediately reverted to her old pattern. She accused him of lying, of not caring about her, of deliberately disrespecting her. She sent him a series of angry, accusatory texts, convinced he was trying to hurt her, to abandon her, to make her feel unimportant. She pushed him away, hard, just as she had done with so many others. This incident, however, played out differently than it would have in the past. After a few days of seething in isolation, Elena found herself rereading her own accusatory messages, and then, slowly, she reread his polite, apologetic explanation. For the first time, she truly saw the situation through a different lens. Her therapist had been working with her on cognitive reframing, on challenging her automatic negative interpretations. And this time, something clicked. She realized her reaction had been disproportionate, fueled by her own fear, not by his actions. It was a crucial moment of self-awareness. Instead of letting the relationship completely unravel, Elena did something she had never done before. She swallowed her pride, admitted her mistake, and apologized. She explained to him that she had an issue with trust, that her reaction was about her own past, not about him. To her surprise and relief, he was understanding. He acknowledged her honesty and expressed a willingness to continue, but also gently set boundaries, emphasizing the need for open and calm communication. This was a monumental step for Elena. It wasn't just about making an apology. It was about accepting responsibility, revealing vulnerability, and allowing another person to see her imperfections without pushing them away entirely. It was a small victory, but a significant one. The outcome of Elena's journey, in the grand scheme of things, wasn't a dramatic, instantaneous transformation into a perfectly adjusted individual. That's simply not how real psychological healing works. There was no magical cure, no switch that suddenly flipped. Instead, what emerged was a more nuanced, more realistic evolution. Elena continued her therapy, and while the battles against her ingrained patterns were ongoing, she gained more ground than she lost. She learned to pause, to question her initial emotional reactions, and to understand that not every perceived slight was a personal attack. She developed a deeper, albeit still fragile, sense of self-worth that wasn't entirely dependent on external validation. Her relationship with Maria also saw a gradual improvement. They still had their moments of tension, but the toxic cycle of blame and withdrawal began to break. Elena started calling her mother more regularly, and Maria, for her part, learned to offer support without judgment, to listen without trying to fix everything. There were still lingering wounds, scars that would always be there, but they were no longer festering. There was a sense of quiet understanding, a renewed tenderness that had been absent for decades. Elena's romantic relationships remained challenging, but she was now approaching them with a greater degree of self-awareness and a willingness to be vulnerable. She understood that she needed to choose partners who were patient and understanding, and she was learning to communicate her needs and fears more effectively. She hadn't found the one yet, but she was building a foundation for healthier connections, no longer pushing people away the moment things got real. Her story became a testament to the fact that profound change isn't always about a sudden epiphany, but often about persistent, grueling work. It's about taking those small, difficult steps every single day, even when it feels easier to retreat. Elena's journey was far from over, but she had taken the critical first steps towards living a life guided by conscious choice rather than being perpetually driven by the ghost of her past. She had learned, perhaps for the first time, that she had the power to author her own story, not just relive an old, painful script. And sometimes that's the most profound outcome of all. Watching Elena's journey unfold, even from a distance, reinforced a fundamental truth I've learned over the years on this show. People aren't broken, they're just operating on outdated software, often installed during childhood, that no longer serves them. Elena wasn't a bad person. She was a deeply wounded person, trapped in a self-protective loop that had become more destructive than the original pain it was designed to shield her from. Her aggressive defensiveness, her constant blame shifting, her inability to maintain connections, these weren't character flaws, but rather highly effective, albeit maladaptive survival mechanisms. They kept her safe from perceived abandonment, but at the cost of genuine intimacy and happiness. The real challenge with individuals like Elena isn't just pointing out the problem. It's getting them to recognize that their solution to past pain has become the primary source of their current suffering. It's a bitter pill to swallow for anyone, especially for someone who has spent a lifetime constructing a narrative where they are perpetually the victim. To admit that you are, in fact, an active participant in your own misery, even if unconsciously, requires an immense amount of courage and a willingness to dismantle your entire perception of reality. Elena's initial resistance was entirely predictable, a desperate clinging to the only sense of control she felt she had, even if that control was illusory and destructive. What truly struck me about Elena's progress was the subtle shift in her internal dialogue, the moments where she began to challenge her own thoughts instead of blindly accepting them as truth. That incident with the canceled date, for example, was pivotal. In the past, it would have been absolute proof of betrayal. Another notch in her belt of grievances. But by taking the time to reevaluate, by applying the tools she was learning in therapy, she was able to disrupt that automatic, fear-driven reaction. She didn't instantly become a perfect communicator or a flawless partner. That's an unrealistic expectation for anyone. But she interrupted the pattern. She inserted choice where there had only been reaction. That, in my experience, is where true growth begins. Her relationship with Maria also exemplified this nuanced change. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation where all past hurts were instantly forgotten. Old resentments, particularly on Elena's part, resurfaced. There were still arguments, still moments of frustration, but the difference was the underlying current of genuine effort. Maria learned to hold her boundaries more firmly, to not enable Elena's outbursts while still expressing her love. Elena, in turn, learned to hear Maria's perspective, to acknowledge her mother's own struggles and limitations rather than viewing her solely through the lens of a childhood protector who failed. It became a relationship built on the fragile but growing foundation of mutual respect and understanding rather than obligation and guilt. That's a far more authentic and sustainable outcome than any idealized version of family harmony. Ultimately, Elena's story isn't about achieving a final, perfect state of being. It's about the ongoing process of self-discovery and conscious choice. It's about recognizing that healing isn't a destination, it's a journey. She learned that she couldn't control the past, but she absolutely could control how she responded to it in the present. She learned that vulnerability, while terrifying, is the only true pathway to genuine connection. And she learned that forgiveness, particularly self-forgiveness, for the protective but damaging coping mechanism she developed, was essential for moving forward. Her progress wasn't always linear, and there were undoubtedly times when she wanted to give up, to retreat back into the familiar, if painful, comfort of her old narrative. But the fact that she persisted, that she continued to show up for herself, even when it was incredibly difficult, speaks volumes about the human capacity for change and resilience. She chose to break free from the invisible chains of her past, not because it was easy, but because she finally understood the profound cost of remaining bound by them, and that choice, made repeatedly, day after day, is what ultimately transformed her life. It's a reminder that sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that set us free. You know, it's easy for people to watch a show like mine and expect a neat, tidy ending, a perfect resolution wrapped up in a bow. But life, and certainly human psychology, doesn't work that way. Elena's journey is a powerful testament to the messy, often frustrating, but ultimately profound nature of real change. There was no single magic bullet, no instant cure for decades of deeply entrenched emotional patterns. What we witnessed was the arduous, step-by-step process of dismantling a carefully constructed self-image and rebuilding it on a foundation of truth and self-awareness. One of the most critical lessons Elena had to internalize was that forgiveness isn't necessarily about excusing past behavior, whether it was her father's emotional distance or her mother's perceived inaction. Instead, it was about releasing herself from the prison of resentment. Holding on to that anger, that sense of injustice, was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick. She had been punishing herself and everyone who dared to get close by reliving those past hurts over and over again. The shift came when she realized that letting go of the anger wasn't condoning the past, it was liberating her future. This didn't mean she suddenly had a perfect relationship with her father, who remained largely unchanged, but it meant his impact on her present-day choices significantly diminished. She stopped letting his ghost dictate her living relationships. Her growth in developing true emotional regulation was also remarkable. For so long, her emotions had been like a runaway train, derailing every connection in its path. She would react instinctively, defensively, often with an intensity that overwhelmed those around her. Through consistent therapy and self-reflection, she learned to put a pause between stimulus and response. That moment where she caught herself after sending those angry texts and actually chose to apologize and explain rather than double down on her anger was a monumental win. It showed she was beginning to develop a prefrontal cortex for her emotions, an executive function that could step in and say, hold on, is this reaction truly serving me? Is this consistent with the person I want to be? The outcome of Elena's story is not a definitive happily ever after, but rather a realistic portrayal of sustained progress. She didn't miraculously find a soulmate, nor did her family become a picture of perfect harmony. What she did achieve was a profound internal shift. She moved from being a victim of her circumstances to an active architect of her own life. She learned to discern between genuine threats and perceived threats, to differentiate between a healthy boundary and an act of abandonment. This meant that while she still faced challenges, she now had the tools to navigate them with greater resilience and less self-destruction. Her interactions, even with casual acquaintances, began to change. People who had once found her guarded and abrasive now found her more approachable, more genuine. She was less quick to judge, less prone to see malice where there was none. This subtle but powerful shift meant that people were more willing to give her a chance to see past the old defenses and connect with the person beneath. She wasn't seeking perfection in others, and in turn, she was more willing to let others see her imperfections without fear of immediate rejection. In the end, Elena's story is about empowerment. It's about taking back control of your own narrative. She came onto my stage believing her story was one of continuous betrayal and misunderstanding, a script written by others. She left with the understanding that she had the power to rewrite that script, to acknowledge her past without being defined by it, and to choose a future rooted in authenticity and connection. It's a tough, often painful process. But seeing someone like Elena embark on that journey and watching her find glimmers of light along the way is exactly why I do what I do. It's about helping people confront their truths, no matter how uncomfortable, because that's the only path to true freedom.